Hey guys, I'm Jeremy and I'm here in Buffalo, New York, which is where Timothy Mcveigh was from. He was the most infamous domestic terrorist in all of US history. He killed 168 people on April 19th, 1995 in Oklahoma City. He blew up the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building there, and a third of the entire building had just been blown off basically. So he was obviously an anti-government person, and he was angry at the government for a few reasons. One of the reasons was his service in the first Iraq war called Desert Storm. And then there was a couple other big events that happened in the early 90s, like a standoff in Ruby Ridge, and also another event with the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. That also went really bad. So in this video, I'll go into the background of Mcveigh and this story, and I'll visit some of the locations. I'm here just a little bit east of Buffalo. He grew up just north of here, near Lockport and Pendleton. And so I'll show some drone footage and other things around where he went to school and grew up. And then I'll actually end the video in Denver, which is where I'm going back to next, because that's actually where he was tried for these crimes in the end. So Mcveigh was born on April 23rd, 1968 in Lockport, New York. He was the only son and second of three children. His parents got divorced when he was about 10 years old, and he was raised afterwards with his father in Pendleton. And I think he's actually still alive. He's in his 80s, but he's still around. He's reconciled with some of the victims of the bombing, and he's been in the public to an extent. I think his mother died a while ago and didn't really talk to the press, and I know his sisters didn't at all. So I'm not sure when things changed for him. It seemed like he was pretty outgoing when he was younger, and then maybe after that divorce is when he got a little bit more shy, and he was even a little bit bullied. And later on, when he testified to the FBI and different people about some of his beliefs, he thought that the US government was like the ultimate bully, and I think that could stem from his childhood possibly. He was introduced to firearms by his grandfather, and he got like super into guns after this point. He even said he wanted to become a gun shop owner, and even took firearms to his school to show people, which is kind of crazy, especially nowadays. And later he gets into books like Soldier of Fortune and the Second Amendment rights, which is the right to bear arms and to have a militia. So he went to Star Point High School, which is when he became really interested in computers, and I guess he was really good at it because he was able to hack into a government site or something like that. So it's too bad he didn't pursue like any career in that. Later, he did go to Bryant and Stratton College, which is more of a trade school, but they do have four-year programs, but he ended up dropping out. But he did finish high school. He didn't get really high grades or anything like that. And then he went into work as like a security guard, and the people at his work even said, like, this guy's crazy about guns. He'd come with like so much extra ammo and things that he would never need, but just a super big gun nut. So 2 years after high school, he enlists in the United States Army in May of 1988. When he's 20 years old, he goes to Fort Benning, where he has his basic training and advanced individual training to be an infantry soldier. And so one of the books he read while he was in the Army is the Turner Diaries, which was written by William Luther Pierce in 1978. And this book in general has been super popular in like white supremacist circles. And William Pierce was actually probably the most prominent white supremacist of like that time. So just to give you a brief idea of the Turner Diaries, it takes place sometime in the future where like the government's taken over by quite a lot of minorities and like white liberals who actually are oppressing the whites and preventing like free speech and allowing them to be victimized. They're also taking away guns rights and things like that. And so there's this huge civil war that not only happens in the United States, but like around the world. And there's even like nuclear weapons involved. And in the end, the whites basically kill all of the other races of the world pretty much. And so one of the things they plan to do in the book is to bomb an FBI building. So this could have inspired not just Mcveigh, but other people to do different things. And in general, the white nationalist groups in the 90s were like super brazen because you didn't really have a lot of cameras back then. And there was like not only some assassinations of people around the like 80s and 90s, but they had like robbed tons of banks and had gotten away with quite a lot. So Timothy McVeigh was like super in this book. He'd show it to all of the people in his platoon and that he was in the army with. And then years later, he would even sell that book at gun shows. And even had pages of the book in the car he was arrested in after he blew up the federal building in Oklahoma. So his platoon sergeant was Terry Nichols. And he was about 10 years older than him, but they had all of the same ideas. They were into the book Soldier of Fortune. They were into survivalism, militias, and guns, in the Second Amendment. So they were quite good friends, and they later got stationed at Fort Riley in Kansas, where they met another accomplice, Michael Fortier. So these three were somewhat involved to varying degrees in the Oklahoma City bombing. So after he was in the Army a couple of years, there was an event that happened in the Middle East that would bring the United States and many other countries to attack the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. So what basically happened was, in August of 1990, Iraq attacked Kuwait. There was some dispute over oil, and Kuwait has a ton of oil and is a much smaller country. And so it was much easier for them to attack. And Iraq also owed a ton of money to Kuwait for the wars they just had against Iran, which lasted from 1980 to 1988. It was a brutal war that most people don't even know about, but hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people died. The rest of the world was worried that he would continue from Kuwait and attack Saudi Arabia. And so they were worried about that. And of course, the United States was, because that's where we were getting most of our oil from at the time. So they ended up getting a big coalition of about 42 countries. It was mostly the US, Saudi Arabia, the UK, and Egypt, but dozens of other countries. And they tried to negotiate for several months, and nothing happened. And so they finally started an aerial bombardment of the Iraqi forces in Kuwait and other places for a few weeks. And then later they brought in the ground troops. And the Iraqi forces were no match for the U.S. military and the combined forces of the world, basically. So it was only a few days long. And Timothy McVeigh was involved in this. He was assigned on one of the M3 Bradley tanks. And so he's a sergeant at that time, and so he has some soldiers beneath him. And so you need to have the morale of your soldiers up, so you don't want to see like you're afraid or scared. So he's like really pumped up. He's blasting heavy metal. He looks like he's all excited and getting into it. And when he first encounters an Iraqi soldier who is about a kilometer away, he actually ended up using the tank round and like hit him directly and like blew him up. And so he definitely had killed at least a couple of people, maybe not a ton, but then again, who knows? Maybe he shot in other areas. Around this time, they also did something which was controversial, which was to put plows on the M1 Abrams tanks and basically drive into the trenches where the Iraqi soldiers were and like turn and just go through. So you're just literally mowing people down. He might have not been in the M1 tank, but he was probably the support vehicle nearby in a Bradley. So he not only had seen up close like a lot of dead bodies and things like that, but when they were later going through Kuwait City, he could see not only the destruction, but a lot of children begging for food and the misery of war. So although in front of his troops, he was very courageous, but at the same time, he was writing home and talking to people back home that he didn't like it. And by the end of the conflict, he felt kind of betrayed. He felt like it was like kind of like shooting pigs in a barrel. Like it was so easy that there was really no challenge, and that it wasn't really like a war to liberate them, but just about oil and also about the Israeli influence and things like that. So he kind of felt a little bit betrayed going over there for something that wasn't really justified. And so right after the war, he comes back and he tries out to be a special forces soldier. And he was actually just about to go and try out for that right before the war, but he got sucked into that. But by the time he came back from that, he was a different person. And so he basically ended up failing out within the first couple days. He wasn't in good shape. He wasn't really that into it. And he ended up just quitting basically right away. And then he could have re-enlisted to stay in within the next few months, but he got out, which was much different than when he went in. When he was going in at the beginning, he was so gung-ho about it, and he figured he would stay there like 20 years, and now he did, about 3 years and got out, which is quite normal. I went in 4 years, and it's like, I was pretty over it by about, a few months. I was looking at my watch, like, only 3.5 years left, so it's kind of normal for that kind of thing to happen. So he comes home from the military, and things aren't really great for him. He probably has some depression and maybe some PTSD, but he might have even had Gulf War syndrome, which happened to hundreds of thousands of people that served over there, not just Americans, but anyone who served in the war. And it was some unusual symptoms, like you could be tired, you could vomit, a headache, like all kinds of negative things are happening to your health. And it probably came from things like a mild amount of sarin gas that was in the air. And also when all of these tanks and planes and everything are blowing up everything, there's all these chemicals and toxic things in the air. So it's not a huge surprise that some people get sick from these kinds of things. And so he even goes to the VA hospital in Buffalo, which is actually a pretty well-funded veterans hospital, and they didn't really help him much, which is a big shame. So he goes on and has some dead-end jobs in Buffalo and tries dating some women unsuccessfully, but things don't really work out. He even got into gambling a bit and lost a bunch of money, sadly on the Buffalo Bills. Most of us know that the Buffalo Bills lost not once or twice or 3 times in a row, but 4 times. A very sore subject for most Bills fans out there like myself and others. So he lost some money on those games, which was definitely a bummer. And around that time, he writes some articles to some local papers complaining about taxes and things like that. So over the next couple of years, he goes around the country to see his friends. So he sees Terry Nichols, who was his platoon sergeant. He was up in Michigan where he was living on his brother's farm. And then he goes down to see his other buddy, Michael Fortier, in Arizona. And later, Terry Nichols moves down to Kansas and is like a farmhand there. So he's kind of going back and forth from Kansas to Arizona and back up to Michigan. Because even though Terry Nichols wasn't living there, he was friends with his brother. So he's kind of going not just there, he's also going to gun shows all over the country. So he's just driving all around the country. And this is where he networks and becomes friends with tons of different people there. And a lot of these people are into like anti-government groups or white nationalist groups. So in 1993, there were 2 really big events that really triggered the anti-government people. And that was a standoff in Ruby Ridge, and the other one was with the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. The one in Waco, Texas was really big. The one in Ruby Ridge was smaller, but I'll explain both of them. So in Ruby Ridge, you got this guy, Randy Weaver, who got out of the military during Vietnam, and he becomes like a fundamentalist Christian. He goes with his wife and later 4 kids up to northern Idaho near the Canadian border because it's remote, and he wants to be away from all of the corrupt society and evil government. And that's where he homeschools his kids and kind of lives up there. And at some point he ends up going to Aryan Nations meeting and meets an undercover ATF agent. That's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. And he offers to sell him 2 sawed-off shotguns, which are illegal. And then he says I could get a few more shotguns in the next week to him. And so this is what led for them to make an arrest warrant for him. And so he gets the notice to appear in court, and he says that the government is evil, so he doesn't appear in court. And so they end up issuing an arrest for him. And he's at home with his 4 kids and his wife and his friend Kevin Harris. And so the ATF shows up, and there was a standoff for 11 days, but I think most of the shooting was in the first couple days. And so his son, Sammy Weaver, is outside in the woods with Harris near the cabin, and they encountered the ATF agent. And so there's a shootout there that happens, and the dog is killed, and Randy Weaver's son is shot in the back as he's running away, and one of the U.S. Marshals is shot and killed as well. And so it's not a surprise that they bring in a sniper team after that, and they have instructions not to shoot at anyone unless they leave the cabin with a weapon, which doesn't happen. One of these snipers ends up shooting his wife through the window while she's holding a baby. So she didn't even have a weapon on her. And then Kevin Harris, his friend, ends up critically wounded. And Randy Weaver is also shot. And so they have a civilian mediator come in who also has similar views as Randy. He eventually convinces, first his friend surrendered so he could get the medical attention, and then he surrendered with his 3 daughters. And he ended up having most of the charges dropped against him, except for the failure to appear in court. And so he does 18 months of jail. And then, of course, there's a big civil lawsuit, and the government didn't want to go to trial. So his daughters each got $1 million, and then he got $100,000 for the death of his wife and his son. So naturally, a lot of people were quite annoyed because it didn't seem like they needed to use this excessive force. They could have either waited, and they had also killed his wife while she's holding a baby inside the house, and they had shot his son in the back. So a lot of not just fundamentalist Christians, but anti-government people, and I think the general public thought this was like an excessive use of force. But this didn't even come close to what would happen a few months later. So out in Waco, Texas, there was this guy, David Koresh. He had actually changed his name to David Koresh because he said he was the spiritual descendant of King David. And so he didn't start this group, the Branch Davidians. It was actually another guy, and his son was supposed to take over, but somehow David managed to take over this group, basically, and had a big following. And among many of his interesting ideas was the idea that God told him to procreate with the women in the group to establish a house of David, of his special people. This involves separating married couples in the group, and they had to agree that only he would have sexual relations with their wives, and they would have to practice celibacy. And then, not surprisingly, he also had a lot of inappropriate relations with underage girls who were as young as 12 and 13, and there were also other abuses. And not a surprise, some of the people had left his church, and so people became aware that he wasn't just practicing polygamy and abusing and having sexual relationships with underage women, but they were also stockpiling tons and tons of guns. And around that time, a UPS delivery person had notified the FBI and said that a half dozen grenades were supposed to be delivered to that house, and they intercepted it, basically. So, of course, law enforcement was getting involved and starting to surveil the area and see what was going on. And even some local farmers had reported that they had heard not just regular gunfire, but 50 caliber machine gun shots going off. So they knew that they were going to have to eventually move in and try to confiscate these guns. And so they're planning on doing a raid because they knew that this guy's got not only a bunch of guns, but doing all kinds of other inappropriate things, basically. So on February 28th, they conducted their raid. It's unclear who actually made the first shots. Some people say that they heard some shots from inside the building, and then the Branch Davidians said that it was one of the ATF guys or government people who shot first. So that's actually unclear. It could have been an ATF agent actually mistakenly fired there. But there's no doubt that the people inside are super paranoid because they're a bunch of fundamentalists who believe in the apocalypse and they think it's coming soon. And so you have all these people surrounded and they're all freaking out because they think it's the end of the world. And there's a big shootout for about 2 hours, and 4 agents were killed and over a dozen wounded. And then 5 Branch Davidians were also killed until there was a ceasefire. And so David Koresh still had phone access for a day or two and started talking to local news stations and having interviews and stuff until the FBI cut his phone. And then they were the only ones that were able to talk to him after that. And so they thought that they made some breakthroughs in negotiations in the first few days. David said that he would release them if he was able to broadcast a message on the national radio. And they did this. But he didn't agree after that. He said that God told him to wait. But at least he did release 19 children who were 5 months to 12 years old, but without their parents. and there were still 98 people inside their compound. So on April 14th, Koresh released a letter to his lawyer, and this would prove to be his last communication to the outside world. He claimed he wanted to write down his interpretation of the 7 seals of the book of Revelation. And after he finished writing that, he promised to exit the compound and everyone be released, basically. So I don't know how long this would take. I'm not surprised if it would be several weeks, but that's what he told everyone. And so the people in law enforcement had 2 ideas. They were like, we can either wait for this guy to write this book and try to do this peacefully, or we could go in aggressively. So around this time, Bill Clinton had actually just been elected about 3 or 4 months before, and he had appointed Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General, and she was also new at that time. She wanted to take the more hawkish stance, and he wanted a more peaceful resolution. And he even cited an incident in 1985. This group called the Covenant, the Sword in the Arm of the Lord, had a big issue, similar circumstances to this, or Randy Weaver basically, where these people were, inside this compound, but they were able to resolve it peacefully. Now, this didn't go on for like 5 weeks like this Waco siege, but they were able to resolve it peacefully nevertheless. But Janet Reno objected, and she was saying basically like, this is costing $1 million a week. No matter what, this is going to end in bloodshed. He's going to keep abusing these young girls, and they're probably going to have a mass suicide event at the end anyway. And he could wait them out for weeks and weeks or years, and they didn't have that much time to wait, basically. So it's ironic that the group I just mentioned, the Covenant, the Sword in the Arm of the Lord, that happened in 1985, they had that peaceful resolution on April 19th, 1985. And guess when they attacked the Branch Davidians? On April 19th, 1993. And so they knew that everyone was armed tooth and nail inside. And so in the lead up to this, they had actually already had like 3 Bradley tanks going around the complex. They were blasting either loud music or different sounds of things to keep them sleep deprived. And then they eventually cut off the electricity and the water. And so this was also highly controversial because it's like, these people think it's the end of times and the apocalypse is coming, and then all these things seem like a test to them. So they come in on April 19th, 1993, with all of these like heavy-duty engineering vehicles, kind of like, almost look like APCs or something. And what they did was they knocked holes into the building and they pumped some CS gas, like tear gas, into the building. They were hoping everyone would run out, but that didn't work. They weren't supposed to shoot at the Branch Davidians. So it was just supposed to be the tear gas. But as soon as they saw the people moving in and the fact that they were, busting in the walls with this gas, made them fire on the law enforcement there. And so there was a big shootout on both sides for a few hours. And so some of the tear gas they used with like a grenade launcher, and they had a few different things they used that might have been pyrotechnic, which means basically like it could possibly start a fire. So they didn't intend to do that maybe, but anyway, around noon or so, the building erupted into like 3 separate fires. So they're not sure if the government did that or if people inside set fire to the building. And so about 9 people escaped, and the rest of the people died either of the fire, carbon monoxide poisoning, gunfire, etc. And David Koresh was also dead. I think he may have had a self-inflicted gunshot. So after 51 days, it resulted in the death of 82 Branch Davidians, and about 20 to 28 of them were children. So it wasn't just the anti-government people, but I think most people in general thought that this was a big government overreach. And in general, they could have handled this better, because obviously it looks really bad. I mean, basically, it looks like people were burned alive. So definitely not great for optics. So Mcveigh was actually up at Terry Nichols' farm up in Michigan and had seen what was going on. And so he actually drove down there and was there for the whole siege, handing out literature and protesting with the other people there. And so he saw the whole thing go down, including the fire. And he had also seen them using Bradley tanks, which ironically is what he used in the Iraq War. So before, he was using these for what he believed was an unjust war. And now the government is using this against its own civilians in an unjust way. And so this was not just a turning point for McVeigh, but it was also a turning point in American history, actually, around this time, because it was only a couple years before that the United States had won the Cold War. And say up until that time, the issues were much more related to defense and security and things like that. Every president before that, besides Jimmy Carter, had been a Republican since the late 60s. You had Nixon, and then you had Ford, and then after Jimmy Carter, you had Reagan, and then Bush. And most of the Republicans are more for guns rights, basically, and Democrats generally, especially nowadays, are more against the Second Amendment, or at least they're for regulating the access to guns or things like that. And so after such a long period of having mostly Republicans, and now that the Cold War was over, people wanted to turn to more social issues in America, and also some restrictions on people buying guns and things like this. So it wasn't really a surprise that Bill Clinton got into office, but he was seen at that time as quite far left. Now today it doesn't really seem like it at all, but at that time I think it was quite a big deal. And in his first couple years in office, he passed a couple bills. The first one was the Brady bill, and this bill basically made it so there was like a 5-day waiting period and some other things. And then the next year there was an assault weapons ban, and this restricted some of the guns people can get, and you couldn't have more than like 10 bullets in a clip or something. But he was definitely one of the first presidents to make restrictions on the Second Amendment. And so the events in Waco, the gun control, and other liberal policies made McVeigh and others think that the Turner Diaries were coming true. The government was going to come in and restrict guns and take away people's rights. So he was all paranoid about this. And so for the next few months, he went around the country at all these gun shows, and he went to 40 states, and this was basically his home. He had met and networked with all of these different people, and as he went further west, people were more into guns, basically, until you got to the People's Socialist Republic of California. He also sold the Turner Diaries there. And so he ended up living in Arizona with his army buddy, Michael Fortier. And they were really close. McVeigh was actually the best man in his wedding. And it was also during this time that he not only got into smoking marijuana, but also using methamphetamines. And so I'm not sure the extent of how much he used, but we already know he drove all over the country to all these gun shows, and he'd go back from Arizona to Michigan to Buffalo, back to Kansas. So there's good reason to believe he was on meth quite a lot during this time. I don't know the extent. I know at one time I read that he tried to actually kind of like break away from Fortier for that reason, because he was using too many drugs, but I'm not sure his extent of use. But there's some obvious bad things about using meth, besides keeping you up for days and days and the bad health effects. But it's known to make people quite paranoid. And so you could just imagine that he's driving around and using these drugs all the time, and there's these thoughts racing through his mind, which are quite paranoid. So obviously, in theory, there could be a situation where it could turn out a little bit like the Turner Diaries. But to most normal people, obviously, that doesn't seem very realistic. So I think this drug use was really, really bad for him. And I think it was a big reason he went over the edge. And so before he was committed to doing the bombing, he actually considered carrying out some high-profile assassinations, like against Janet Reno, or the judge who presided over the Waco trial, or maybe the Ruby Ridge one, and also against the sniper who killed Vicki Weaver. And so that was his first idea, but he realized that would be much more difficult and he might only get one person. So he committed to the bombing of the federal building. But I guess afterwards he did admit that he would have rather committed like some assassinations and blown up that building. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that he ended up killing a bunch of kids too, which I mean, it was bad enough to kill a bunch of civilians who aren't related to that. But the killing of kids is what made him be considered so evil and notorious. So early on, Terry Nichols had shown him how to make some basic explosives. And then over time, he learned more about that and the materials he'd need. I think some of the things you could buy, like at stores, like some fertilizer, different things, but they would need more things if they were to carry out like a huge explosion. So they actually ended up going to rob a business that operated a quarry, because a quarry, they're just blasting rocks to get the natural resources. And so they robbed this quarry of a bunch of explosives. And they also got money in a few other ways. They had sold some guns at some of these gun shows. Terry Nichols had sold a bunch of the gold he had to support this operation and support McVeigh financially. And McVeigh was probably involved with at least a couple robberies, or maybe only one, but one of them was actually a guy he befriended at a gun show in Florida. He actually possibly robbed this guy's house. They're not 100% sure, but they took like tons and tons of guns and other things this guy had before the bombing. And I mentioned how there was like those white supremacist groups who were going around the country robbing banks. He might have been involved in at least one of those bank heists. And so those were, other ways that he was raising money, because it's not like he really had any job or anything of any importance over this time. So he eventually chooses Mira Federal Building in Oklahoma City because he thinks some of the federal agents might be in that building, which I'm not even sure if that's true, because the Waco thing happened in Texas. So I assume it was just people in Texas. Maybe they had some people from Oklahoma. So I'm not even sure if there's anyone even involved with that, to be honest. But that's why he chose it. And so he actually goes out there around the Christmas of 1994 with Michael Fortier, and they actually do a 30-minute tour of the building. And at the bottom of the building, there's a daycare center. So there's like a few dozen kids in this daycare center during the day. So that's extra evil that he was aware that there was a daycare center there before he did the bombing. In Fortier, and I think even Terry Nichols didn't want to go through with it because of that reason, but McVeigh said, look what happened at Ruby Ridge. They killed kids. Look what they did in Waco. They killed kids. Look at the Iraq War. Like, kids die. It's just part of war, basically, is the way he looked at it. And so then the last thing he had to do was really decide on a date that he wanted to do it. And he decides on April 19th, 1995, which was exactly 2 years after the siege on Waco. And it wasn't just that. It was ironically also when some white supremacist guy, Richard Snell, was to be executed. This guy in the 80s had killed a guy in his store who he assumed was Jewish, and he wasn't. And so he killed that guy, and then a year or two later, he had gotten pulled over by a state trooper who was black, and he had killed him. So he got the death penalty, and he was going to be executed on April 19th. And that guy was like semi-famous in like the white supremacist movement. And ironically, that guy Richard Snell had planned to blow up a federal building. And I think it might have even been that one. And he said on the day of his execution, something bad like that would happen. And that morning, of course, the explosion went off, and he had seen it on TV, and he's like, holy crap. He was like, couldn't believe it, but he was happy because it was like his crazy revelation had come true, basically. So McVeigh assembles the last parts of the bomb in Kansas, not far from where he was stationed from, with Terry Nichols, and they put it in the back of a rented Ryder truck. It had about 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and nitromethane. And then he went to Oklahoma City, and he had an extra car waiting for him for when he was to detonate it. And now, even till this day, they weren't sure if he was with anyone else, but tons of eyewitnesses say that there was another guy in that Ryder truck with him when he picked up the van and when he drove to that building. And it wasn't Terry Nichols or Fortier, because they had alibis. And so even till this day, they have no idea who the other person was. They obviously assume it was someone he met over the years at one of these, like, gun shows or white supremacist meetups or whatever. And so he goes to the federal building before 9 that morning on April 19th. And he actually tried to drive in the basement first, but the roof of the van was too high. So he just parked in front. He lit a fuse that had 2 minutes left. And then he got in his getaway car and basically took off. And the entire front of that building was blown up, about a third of it. So you got to imagine, like, there were basically people in that building who were sitting, and you could be in a big office room, and just literally half of the whole room just falls down, and all of those people died. And then in the other side of the room, people were fine. So that day, 168 people were killed, including 19 children, and 684 were wounded. And so this was the biggest domestic attack in U.S. history, even till today, because September 11th was from the outside, basically. And Mcveigh later said if he knew there was a daycare center, he wouldn't have done it. But we all know he visited it, a few months before, so I think he's lying there. And Terry Nichols even testified against him that he was aware of that. So just 90 minutes after the bombing, he's going down the expressway in Oklahoma, going as fast as he can without a license plate. So he got pulled over by a state trooper, but he saw that he had a weapon under his shirt. It was like kind of bulging out, and he admitted he had a weapon there. And so he has to go to jail for about 3 days while that's going through for not having a license plate and having this weapon. And in the meantime, they had found the axle of the truck and looked at the serial number and found that it came from somewhere in Kansas, and then they traced it back to his name. And they had talked to people at various hotels, and they had figured out that it was Timothy Mcveigh. And so someone calls the Bureau's Criminal Justice Information Services Division, and they're checking to see like if this guy's in jail or anything, and he is in Oklahoma, and he was just about to be released. And at the last moment, they're like, nope, hold him. This is our guy. And then later they found some of his clothing, and it had like traces of the chemicals he used in the bombing. And then they questioned a bunch of people, and they were aware of his ideas and how there was some involvement from Fortier and Terry Nichols. And so of course it's not very bright to drive without a license plate after you plan out a huge bombing, but it's believed that it's possible that he wanted to get caught and that he wanted to take sole responsibility. He even bragged after people suggested there was a bunch of people that had helped him. He said, why don't you think I couldn't do this alone? So he wanted to take all the responsibility just to feed his ego, basically. And they considered trying him in Oklahoma, but he's obviously not going to get an impartial jury there. And so they end up moving his case to the federal courthouse in Denver, Colorado, which is where I'll continue the story next. So I'm back here in Denver, just outside the courthouse where Timothy Mcveigh was tried and ultimately found guilty. No surprise there. His trial went on in '97, and then he actually got the death penalty by lethal injection in June 2001. So it's actually just 3 months before September 11th. And Terry Nichols also was found guilty, eventually of like 160 counts for murder. And he ended up getting, consecutive life terms for all of that. So he's at ADX Florence, which is the most highly secure prison in the United States, with the biggest criminals from around the world basically are there. So they're in like a 7-by-11-foot prison cell and only get an hour out each day, and the rest of the time it's solitary confinement. So, and not that I feel bad for him, but at the end he wanted to pull out, but he had still helped to make the bomb. And he had actually just gotten married and had a couple kids a few years before that. And so, I guess maybe his kids got to visit him in prison the last, almost 30 years now. And then Michael Fortier was lucky. He actually ended up testifying against Mcveigh and Nichols. And he only got about a 12-year sentence because he had helped them too with some of the plans and making some of the fake IDs. And his wife also got out of basically doing prison time, so they're really lucky.
So obviously there's a lot of conspiracy theories about this. I'm not going to go into all of these kinds of things, but it seems like there was definitely another person involved with Timothy McVeigh. Other people seen 2 Ryder trucks at the lake where they were assembling the bombs. So some pretty weird stuff there. You can look at other channels and other videos. I know Black Pilled did a good series called PatCon. I could put a link below, and he did like several hours on this whole story from Ruby Ridge to Waco and a lot of these other things. So that's a pretty good resource. So of course, Timothy McVeigh and these guys are responsible for everything, but you know, the government also made a lot of mistakes. They had already messed up Ruby Ridge, and they could have tried to do this a little bit better. Of course, it's not easy. This guy, David Koresh, wanted to write all these books, and they don't want to sit there forever. There could have been more abuse, but I think they could have handled that a bit better, because what happens is that they not only piss off the people who are involved and their families, but hundreds of thousands of other Americans, if not millions. And it only takes a few people out of, 1 out of 100,000 or 1 out of 1,000,000 that might do something crazy like Timothy McVeigh. And then suddenly, hundreds of other people are injured and killed. So the government really needs to be, really cautious and handle these things better. And the only good thing to come out of that is that they have. In recent years, I've seen situations where they have standoffs with people, and they basically, they'll just let that person sit in their house for the next 20, 30 years, and if they come outside and off that property, they'll arrest them, but they're not going to go in and end up jeopardizing the lives of the people inside or the federal officers. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I'll have some more cool things out. I was actually going to do JonBenet Ramsey because they just finished that series recently. And then I'll do maybe something on JFK and some other things. And so anyway, I'll see you next time. Like and subscribe, and take care.
I'm dreaming. I'm putting down my dreams, If I could rob a genie in a bottle, that's what I wish for, right? So.